Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Greg Knuckles.
I am Pack.
And I'm Milo.
And we have another great episode for you today. In this episode, we are discussing lifting and mental health. I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast is well aware that there are a plethora of benefits to exercise in general and lifting weights and resistance training specifically. And, I'm sure most people listening to this are already very on board with that general statement. But there are a lot of, I think, under-discussed benefits of exercise. Most people tend to think about it in terms of just, hey, this will help me get stronger, or this will help me improve my body composition, or this will help me live a little bit longer. All of which are extremely valid and good things. But, at the end of the day, we live in our own heads, right? Like, we live in an embodied world with other people, but ultimately you're spending 24 hours a day, or depending on whether you think you're still present with yourself when you're sleeping, maybe 16 hours a day with you and the person in your head. So there is quite a bit of evidence that exercise in general and lifting specifically does also improve mental health, or is at least associated with higher ratings of mental health and better outcomes in many regards. And I think that is an under-recognized and underappreciated thing. So that is what we're going to be discussing in this episode. Before we dive into it, if this isn't too personal, let's all give a little checkup from the neck up. How do you guys think your mental health is? If you're comfortable sharing.
Are we sharing diagnoses or just saying, yep, feeling good?
You can take this any way you want. That was just an open question.
I'll let Milo go first.
I can go first if you want me to break the ice.
Go first.
Go first, yeah. Hit it.
I think I'm doing generally okay. I think I have a relatively normal amount and type of negative affect from time to time, little stress, little anxiety, sometimes feeling a little blue, but I think about as much as normal, maybe a little less than normal. I tend to be a pretty chill, high affect individual. I think my mental health is pretty decent.
Damn, Pack.
And maybe it's because I'm lifting. Who knows? If I didn't, maybe I'd be a wreck. Who knows?
Mental health on my end is also pretty decent. I am a big advocate for mental health. You know how that's it's become a bit of a thing. People say, yep, I support mental health. And I'm like, are there people out there not supporting mental health? But
that is one of the best things to like get on board with. It's like, oh yeah, like I like so support animals in the shelter not just getting like ground up and turned into hamburger meat. That is something that I believe in very strongly, and that's a moral stance that I believe. Things that are like that uncontroversial. Whoa. It's like,
that's a hot take.
Yeah,
now, Greg.
I support mental health. Cool. Yeah. No, I go ahead.
Yeah, but I see it more and more. I see the words mental health being used as like oh yeah, I'm in support of it's become a bit of a thing lately for people to claim that they support mental health, and I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean everything? Are you specifically referring to one part of mental health? But I digress, and my mental health is fine. I guess I am a big psychologist enjoyer. I've been a big proponent of seeing a psychologist for many years now. And yeah, I can confidently say that things feel pretty good. Obviously, ups and downs and all that jazz, but we're feeling good.
Glad
This
to
has
hear it.
been oddly positive and non-specific, but I'll keep up the positive streak and say that I think my mental health is about as good as it's been in like 5 or 10 years all told. Like, I've dealt with various degrees of chronic insomnia, depressive disorder, and anxiety and stuff. But like overall, now is about as good as it's been in about 10 years. And that is amidst realistically the highest workload and the highest sort of chronic stress, quote unquote. So honestly, I can't complain. I am a big advocate for mental health, just despite PAC, but also specifically doing things that further your mental health. And that is to say lifting, for instance, and, you know, getting some steps in, just doing things that better your mental health. So yeah, man, I'm feeling pretty good, about as good as I have in a while. So let's kick it off.
That's why I wanted
I'm
you
so
to
glad
go
to hear
first. Just so I wanted to do a temperature check and see if the diagnosis would be out there so I can then share mine. But if I didn't want to be the guy that would start sharing and then I'd get the look of, this is TMI, bro. We don't want to
It's
hear
fine.
about that.
If
So-
you're comfortable sharing, you know.
For sure. Diagnosed with panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And much like Dr. Wolf, the past few years have been the best in terms of general anxiety and panic disorder. And amidst the highest stress and the highest workload I have ever managed. So things are good. And we are here to talk about lifting and other stuff and how that can help. And we can obviously share some anecdotes on how our respective diagnoses were potentially affected by lifting. Not medical advice.
That's also very good to hear. I'm glad that you're doing well these days.
Thank you.
All right. So let's get into the content in a second, but first, standard plugs at the top of the episode. So if you enjoy the podcast, which if you're listening to this, I assume that you do, please like, rate, subscribe, and tell your friends. It really helps us out. If you're interested in hiring a virtual coach to help you with your training and or nutrition, Stronger by Science has an excellent team of coaches that can help you out. You can learn more at strongerbyscience.com/coaching. If you want to purchase supplements from a good source that doesn't have crazy markups, and you also want to get them a little bit cheaper than their already rock bottom prices, check out bulksupplements.com. Use the code SBSPOD at checkout for an additional 5% off. If you want to stay fully up to date with goings on in Stronger by Science land, check out our Facebook group and subreddit. That is Stronger by Science community on Facebook and reddit.com/r/Stronger by Science. And check out our newsletter. We send you high quality, informative content every couple of weeks, not spamming you with a bunch of ads. What is the next newsletter topic again, guys? I mean, by the time this comes out, it will be what is the previous newsletter topic. But you guys have been bringing the heat of late.
I think the next one is PAX. So what's your
Diet
next?
breaks.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that'll be a good one. That'll be a good one. Yeah, nice. So yeah, you can check out the newsletter at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter. And finally, if you have any questions that you would like us to answer on the podcast, feel free to send them to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. And to dramatically increase the odds that we will answer your question versus others, helps to send in a voice clip. So record a voice memo and email that to us, 60 seconds or less. We don't want a bunch of stuff that's like 5 minutes long. You know, So keep it snappy, and we do also answer text questions. But this is a podcast; it's an audio medium, so audio is preferred. Let's get into it. We're talking about lifting and mental health, and I think we are going to start by discussing the general impact of exercise on mood and mood related outcomes. So Milo, take it away.
Yeah, so I think the impact of exercise and lifting more specifically on mental health can be broken down in a few ways. You can kind of view it similarly to how lifting can impact acute responses in protein metabolism and muscle growth, for example, muscle protein synthesis, and then when performed chronically can improve your muscle growth outcomes. It's kind of the same thing with exercising in your mental health, where there's research on it both acutely and how it potentially boosts your mood and overall mental health when you perform it just in the upcoming day or a few days or what have you, but also how it can potentially reduce the risk of developing different disorders or help with coping with different disorders that you already have in different populations, whether we're talking about depression, anxiety, or what have you. So in this episode, really, none of the stuff we discuss will be medical advice, like at all, but we're literally just looking at the research and trying to get at, okay, how does exercise and more specifically lifting impact our mood, mental health, and are there benefits that are often not discussed? Because when it comes to lifting specifically, besides the odd mention of saved by the iron, like that's a common phrase where it's like, oh, I had poor mental health and then I started lifting and now everything is all better, and that is very positive and good. But beyond that relatively superficial, well-intended platitude, I think a lot of people don't actually read into the research on lifting for mental health that much. It's just sort of assume that it's good, but it's more so an assumption than anything informed by much reading of the evidence, which is a shame because by comparison to physical health, where people really, people have been saying for a lot of time now, hey, take the exercise pill. Lifting weights is as important as doing cardio for your physical health. When it comes to mental health, the same isn't really being said quite as much, at least within our circles, within the evidence-based fitness space. It's always about do this for optimum muscle growth or do this to improve your overall health. And it's less so about mental health specifically. At the top of this episode, I want to mention, if you want a very quick summary of this episode, it's basically lifting. It's good for your mental health, both in the short term and in the long term. Now, there are going to be edge cases, but we'll get into those as well a little bit. But first, we'll touch on how exercising broadly can impact your mood. Now, a recent review paper that I read essentially looked at quite a few different studies looking at the effects of exercise acutely on mood. And exercise basically seems to be a good thing in a variety of ways. It seems to enhance positive mood states, decrease negative mood states, and reduce stress. And specifically, these effects appear to subsist or sort of persist for about 24 hours after exercising. And by positive mood states and negative mood states specifically, I mean things like improving on these scales that we use. Those often refer to things like positive mood states being a sense of interest in things, a sense of excitement, a sense of being enthusiastic for things. So essentially just boosting positive emotions while reducing emotions, for example, like distress or feeling upset or feeling guilty, irritable, ashamed, essentially a whole host of negative emotions you could experience day to day and a whole host of positive emotions you could experience day to day. It seems like exercise can positively impact these just acutely. So if you exercise today, turns out that for the rest of the day and for up to 24 hours or so afterwards, you'll probably just feel like you're in a better mood overall. Just fewer negative emotions and more positive emotions. Importantly, within this review paper, the exercise protocols being used did vary quite widely, but exercising consistently leads to improvements in mood, seemingly with not too much of an impact of what form of exercise it is. Which is kind of the first takeaway from this research, is that while certain forms of exercise, based on the intensity and whatever else, might have slightly greater benefits, many forms of movement, physical activity, and exercise do seem to be beneficial for mood. And so if, for example, you don't have access to a gym and you still want to reap the potential acute mood benefits of exercising, don't think that you need to be lifting. You can probably go for a walk, go for a run, or a whole host of other things, and that will still improve your mental health. Like one of the things that I sometimes as a coach, or just as a lifter in general, unfortunately hear being said is that people say, oh, if I couldn't lift, I wouldn't exercise at all anymore. or like lifting is the only thing I would do physically. So if I had an injury and had to stop lifting, I don't think I could cope with it, or I wouldn't do anything else physically active anymore. To me, I think that when you look at the research and you realize, oh, you can get most of the physical health benefits and most of the mental health benefits with little consideration of what exact activity you do, it's probably worth realizing that you're more resilient than that, and that even if you have to stop lifting for X or Y reason, time or whatever else, or availability of equipment, you can still get a lot of the health benefits from exercising. So yeah, that was an interesting takeaway from this study. And specifically, there were also a few studies looking at the effects of exercise in the context of acute stressors, like whether it's during exam season or what have you. And it seems like acutely exercising during a period where you're dealing with an acute stressor, like maybe it's a breakup, maybe it's you're going through exam season and are subjectively dealing with high levels of stress. It seems like exercising can also help in the short term with those sorts of things. One question that does arise from this review paper, it wasn't designed to kind of differentiate between different forms of exercise, just kind of getting a broad insight into the effects of exercise on mood, cognition, neurophysiology, and neurochemistry pathways. One question that did arise, because it wasn't designed to look at this, is there a clear winner in terms of how intense exercise should be? But before we move on to the next topic, I just wanted to get a temperature check and see, what do we think about this paper? Do we think that exercise truly does boost mood? Or has Greg now converted to thinking that exercise is bad for your mental health?
Yeah, we're not doing the contrived debate thing for this episode. No, I do think that it does. So a couple things that I just want to remark upon a little bit here. One is the thing you mentioned about people saying that, like, oh, if I couldn't lift anymore, I probably wouldn't exercise at all. I do suspect that that's not coming so much from like a research and like interest in health type of perspective. Because, like, you know, even if they don't know about mental health benefits, I'm sure that they've had dozens of people tell them throughout their life that, oh, to be healthy, you should like do cardio and go for a jog. But they don't do that. They don't like aerobic exercise. They found lifting. They like lifting. So I kind of suspect that just saying like, well, if you take up some other form of exercise, there would be like health benefits. I don't know if that's going to interest them that much, because they're probably well aware that other forms of exercise have health benefits. I suspect that comes maybe a bit more from almost like identity formation type of stuff. Like I tend to hear that the most from people who are like further into subculture. Like either they're competitive in like powerlifting or physique sports, or they would like to be, and they're kind of like headed in that direction. You know, like it's like when a particular activity becomes like a big enough part of someone's life, I think if that is taken away from them, there is like a pretty big sense of loss that comes along with that. I think in a situation like that, rather than just saying like there are health benefits to doing other things, I think maybe what can be a more productive way to frame it is like making more recourse to kind of like the things that do click with them about lifting. You know, like they probably get some community out of it. There's feelings of like competence and mastery, like things that on a more kind of like squishy level give a pursuit meaning. Like I perceive that more to be like a fear of a loss of meaning and a fear that something else physical wouldn't be able to like convey that same sense of meaning to them. So yeah, I wanted to like briefly remark on that. And I totally forget the other thing I was going to say. So I think that's good for now. And the other thing will probably come back to me at some point.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. unfortunate thing with exercise is that we don't fully understand what mediates a lot of the mood benefits or mental health benefits, as we'll get into in a moment. But certainly I think factors like, oh, how do you feel about that form of exercise as part of your identity, and competence, self-determination theory, and all that stuff can really play into affective responses as well. Pac, anything you want to add on that paper?
No, I was just going to just slightly add to what Greg said. Specifically, for many of us lifters, I think the sense of belonging, especially in certain lifting environments, and having that sort of pseudo, maybe it's not pseudo, but somewhat pseudo camaraderie feeling, where lifting, the Iron Brotherhood is treated as this sort of holy or very, very important thing in our lives, when in reality it's just us lifting weights in a controlled environment. I think that for a lot of lifters, the gym, and I mean, it will depend on the type of gym, but specific types of gym, I think, become sort of a place where they feel like they belong and they're among equals, regardless of whether they're equal in terms of strength or physique development. But that's just an observation of mine as a lifting enjoyer.
Yeah. Oh, I very much agree with that. I did remember the other thing that I wanted to remark upon. And that is that I think one bit of pushback that I already anticipate from this episode maybe is from people who are really, really, really into lifting. Maybe you are already like pretty highly competitive in a particular pursuit. You've been doing it for a while. The like going through the motions of training matters a bit less to you than the outcomes, and you're trying to hit new PRs and reach like the next level. Like maybe you're trying to become nationally competitive or win nationals or win worlds or whatever. Like, you're really trying to like rise in the ranks, and like the outcomes start mattering a lot to you. And like, maybe you've been doing it for a while, so progress is coming considerably slower. Maybe you're starting to collect some chronic injuries and get a little banged up, and like that's very frustrating. I think that like when you reach a certain level of like competitive desire for any sort of like for any sort of like physical pursuit, especially where like the outcomes begin mattering to you a lot more than the process, and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve become more and more frustrating to make progress towards due to injuries or just like experience or like age or whatever else. I do think that for some folks, this can kind of like, in some circumstances, it can kind of like invert a little bit. To where, for weeks or months at a time, you're putting a lot of effort into something and you're not getting the outcomes you want. And that can be frustrating and maybe like negatively impact your mental health. That has definitely happened to me. Like I can 100% cop to that. And I wanted to just kind of like call that out. And the thing I would say about it is that I don't think is as much of a referendum on the physiological impact that exercise is having on mood and mental health outcomes. I think that that's more about kind of like the values you're attaching to it, like, because a lot of times those are folks that like, if they couldn't lift at all, like the type of person that Milo mentioned before, like, if they couldn't lift at all, they might be like in a really bad place. And if they're lifting and like not making progress, they're still in like kind of a bad place. Like the exercise is probably still like physiologically, the exercise itself may still be having like a positive effect, but kind of like the knock-on impact of kind of like the mental frames that they're viewing their outcomes or lack thereof through can then have like negative impacts. So just acknowledging that like that is a dynamic that occurs for a lot of athletes at certain points in their career. But I don't necessarily think that that's a referendum on the impact of exercise per se. And it's more just kind of like the frustration that can come with being stymied when you have like a very single-minded focus on like goal pursuit, regardless of what type of goal that is.
Yeah. And that's something we often discuss among us. And by among us, I mean Milo and I, because aside from co-workers, we're also friends and co-lifters. But lifting for the love of lifting, at least personally, became the ultimate goal, because it sort of helps mitigate some of the negatives of what you just described, where, you know, because we were brought up in either, you know, in an environment where chasing progress was the thing, and that was what was important. You were lifting to get a new PR or to grow muscle, and at some point, progress slows down massively, especially for people that do not, you know, start using PEDs and whatever. And the potential negatives of lifting or taking lifting way too seriously for mental health can, at least in my opinion, somewhat be mitigated with just focusing on the process rather than the outcome, and just enjoying being able to lift and being there with like-minded people and just going through the session, even if the numbers on a particular day are not really the best, or even if you're not close to an all-time PR. And we've had a few sessions like that, especially when traveling, when we both get to train together, where, you know, we're nowhere near hitting any all-time PRs, and we're just there doing the best that we can because we're traveling. And still, those sessions usually feel really good from a mental health perspective. You just appreciate the fact that you're there and you're lifting weights. And that's something I've been trying to preach a bit to quote unquote younger lifters about falling in love with lifting itself. Because if you're in it for the long term, and if your identity is that of a lifter, at some point those insane PRs and, you know, gaining 10 pounds of muscle in a year, those things will come to a halt. And it can be a bit of a, you know, it's not the best place to be if you're just solely focusing on the numbers and the PRs.
Yeah, no, I agree fully. I think especially as you progress throughout the lifting journey, your sense of self-efficacy might have to start, or a sense of competence and self-efficacy from lifting might have to shift from being purely attached to, oh, I'm hitting a PR every week or every few weeks, more so to, okay, I am engaging in the process. I'm being consistent. Oh, I hit 4 workouts this week. And just staying consistent and appreciating the journey for what it's worth. I think your sense of self-efficacy and how you derive meaning from lifting might potentially have to change a little bit as you become more advanced. You were going to say something, Greg? Go for it.
No. I think we can at this point get back on track. There was something else that I was thinking about saying, but I think that's
it. Hey, last time the viewers were very disappointed about the Nordic curl rant.
I think
so. Okay, you got to make it up for them.
I didn't have a Nordic curl rant. I was literally just contemplating whether I wanted to talk shit or not, and I wasn't going to say anything, but I kind of smirked, and you asked like, do you have something to say? You had been saying, like Nordic curls are pretty hard, and it's for almost everyone. It's like just going to be eccentric. And I was just considering like tossing out, get good. Like, you didn't have to like admit to me that you suck at Nordic curls.
That's true though.
But I decided, hey, I'm more pro-social than that. I don't need to talk shit to my co-host to make myself feel like a big man. But now you forced me to, and so I don't feel bad about it.
Bring the hammer down. Imagine he loses it now, and it makes it super awkward. It's like full on goes on.
All right, Greg, I'll be awaiting your Nordic curl video.
Can you do a full Nordic curl?
I would be very impressed.
I honestly have no idea if I still can. Which is another reason that I decided like, maybe I shouldn't talk shit, because if someone called me on it right now, I don't know if I still could. Back when I was like really heavily doing them. So just little story. Travis Mash may still have this video if someone wants to hit him up about it. I don't know. But the gym that I used to train and coach at, Mash Elite Performance, got like a Nordic curl setup at one point. And it was like it was like a strength gym. Like it didn't have many machines and whatnot. And I have just always really liked doing hamstring curls. I have no idea why. I just find them fun. And so when they got a Nordic curl setup, I was very excited about it and just started doing a bunch of Nordic curls. And this was like I wasn't like a little guy at this point. Like I was still competing at 220, I'm pretty sure. I was walking around at like 225. But I got to where I could do like a couple reps of like full eccentric, concentric, strict Nordic curls holding a 45 to my chest. And so like I have been quite good at Nordic curls before. Again, literally no idea if I could do that right now, but yeah, I don't know. I think if you train them, you get better at them.
No, that's a hot take. That is a hot take. Fair enough. But what was your rant for this episode? You were thinking of saying something.
Whoa.
Ah, man.
I'll start talking and you'll remember again. So
I have
mental
forgotten
health.
again. Yeah. Yeah. So the thing that I was just going to note is like, I don't know. I do almost wonder. So I obviously think that like exercise in general tends to have like positive effects on mental health. After this, we're going to talk about a lot more research backing up that perspective. But I do wonder if the way that a lot of kind of like content and advice is framed for people in the iron sports and in the kind of like quote unquote physical culture community, I wonder if a lot of it is pitched in a way that is like most likely to increase the potential downsides to mental health, like the stuff we were just talking about before, getting like overly fixated on outcomes and that potentially like leading in a negative direction. Because like one of the things I always think about is like just the statement of like you shouldn't be exercising, you should be training, you know, like that general perspective of like, oh, like exercising, you're just trying to like go out and like work up a sweat. But like if you're training, you're like recording everything and like always trying to increase the numbers like week over week and whatnot. And I mean, I think that that's necessary advice if someone has competitive aspirations. You know, like if you're trying to lift bigger weights than everyone else, you need to know what weights you're lifting and try to make those numbers go up. You know, like that's fairly unavoidable. But I've seen that perspective extend well past that point to people saying like, you know, kind of like, oh, like anyone needs to be training. Like you need to have a measurable goal with any sort of exercise you're doing and track it and make sure you're like applying progressive overload, kind of like no matter what, regardless of context. Like the perspective of like, you don't need to be exercising, you need to be training, which I think is valid and reasonable advice for people who are trying to compete in something. I think that I'm seeing more and more that getting expanded and just given as like general advice to everyone. And I don't know. I do wonder if that can sometimes be counterproductive, not so much in terms of like a training outcomes perspective, but in terms of like a mental health and kind of like causing anxiety about performance where there doesn't necessarily need to be type of perspective. Like thinking of like middle-aged and older people that I know who are like the most into exercise, and the ones who do it consistently, like it's a big part of their life. They're, you know, every indication is that they're going to do it for a long, long time. very consistently, which is what you want for the general health and longevity benefits that can come from exercise like that. That is, I think, what we're generally trying to promote for most people. It seems like those folks are disproportionately doing things where they're not quite as hung up on the numbers. Like, there's a lot of people who find like a type of group exercise that they just fucking love. Like, maybe it's Zumba, maybe it's yoga, maybe it's CrossFit. But they find something where like they're not worried about the numbers. Someone is just in the front of the room saying like, hey, we're doing some exercise, and like, just follow along. This is what we're doing for the day. And it's going to be challenging. You're going to get your heart rate up, and yeah, you know, it'll be fun. Like, you find a lot of people who are very into that and do stuff like that extremely consistently. And just like casual joggers and casual cyclists that are just like, I don't really care about my times. Like, I just go out like 3 or 4 days a week, just hitting it for like 30 minutes or so, 30 minutes to an hour. And I just want to get a run in. I just want to get a ride in, and I feel better when I do it. And yeah, like I just love it. And how fast am I going? Am I trying to hit PRs? Like, who knows? Who cares? Like, those are the two types of like archetypes of people who I think have the most kind of like stable relationship with exercise that I come across. Because there are also people, like I know a lot of people who have been in iron sports for like 20 years and also never miss a workout, but they do have kind of that more adversarial relationship with exercise sometimes, where it's just like, oh man, like, my best days are behind me. I haven't hit a PR in 5 years, and I kind of fucking hate it now, but also I love it. And if I stopped training like this, I would kind of like lose a sense of identity or sense of community that comes along with it. And that's not everyone. Like, there are certainly people who've been in the iron game for 20 years who still just absolutely love lifting. And I think a lot of those folks get there because they have fallen more in love with the process than the outcomes. But yeah, I don't know. I do think that I'm seeing a trend towards a greater, towards more people recommending an outcome focused orientation towards exercise, even for people for whom that may not necessarily be needed for the types of outcomes they're trying to get from exercise. And I don't know, like, I don't think it's like the worst thing in the world, but it does concern me a little bit. Like, for folks who aren't trying to be a competitive athlete, like, you don't need to approach your training as if you're trying to be, I think.
Yeah.
Milo, sorry. I was going to say Milo and Pac and I have actually discussed this in the past, where I think quite a substantial proportion of people getting into the gym at first don't really do so for health necessarily. Like, that might be a secondary reason or what have you. And obviously the advice that you give someone if they're like, look, I need to get in shape in 6 months and I just want to get healthy overall, that advice can actually diverge quite a bit. So yeah, it's just an interesting distinction to draw. And I think definitely that if your main aim with lifting is to get a mental health benefit, maybe don't be super gung-ho all the time about you need to get the next PR or otherwise you're wasting your time in the gym. That's kind of my my advice there. So the next paper essentially tried to look at, all right, so we know exercise is good for your mood, and we live in a society where acute stressors happen all the time and exercise happens to be free. So as far as interventions go to deal with stressors and better your mood and what have you, exercise is one of the better ones. So we want to determine what is the best form of exercise to improve your mood acutely. Broadly speaking, amongst around 38 studies, the largest improvements in mood appeared to happen with sort of moderate intensity exercise. Now, in this meta-analysis, they categorized, in the systematic review, they categorized exercise intensity in a very odd fashion. Essentially, different studies report on aerobic versus anaerobic exercise differently, and so categorizations aren't perfectly consistent. But broadly speaking, it seemed like a moderate intensity exercise modality was generally most effective at improving mood, but that intensity didn't play this huge role. There was, once again, you could see improvements in mood whether you were exercising at a higher intensity or a slightly more moderate intensity. Importantly, the minimum effective dose for improving mood seemed to be as little as 10 to 15 minutes. I see Pac raising his eyebrows because I just stole his trademarked term. But it seems like with just 10 to 15 minutes of exercising, you can actually see an improvement in mood. Oftentimes in these studies, improvements in mood from 10 to 30 minutes of exercise were similar to improvements in mood from 30 to 60 minutes of exercise. So just from a sort of broad takeaways perspective, if you don't have much time to exercise and you're pondering whether or not it's even worth getting into a quick workout or maybe even having a brisk walk or what have you, for your mood, even if you just have 10 to 20 minutes, it may actually make a meaningful difference in terms of your mood. So don't think that just because you're short on time, you can't see an improvement, which goes back to something you also kind of see in the lifting research when it comes to hypertrophy and strength, is that, hey, even if you don't have a ton of time, you may still be able to see meaningful improvements in your hypertrophy, strength, or even in your mood when you exercise. Then they also try to identify different mechanisms or reasons as to why exercise seems to acutely and pretty quickly improve your mood. There's a lot of different potential contributors or sort of frameworks within which it's being seen. For example, there's the social cognitive theory, which essentially anchors the improvement in mood in social and cognitive effects. For instance, that exercising is one way to improve your sense of competence and self-efficacy, or essentially a way to see yourself progress, which can then help your self-esteem and a variety of other factors that can carry over to your overall life a little bit better. There's also other things like the distraction hypothesis, where it's sometimes hypothesized that because exercise involves you taking a break from stressful events in your everyday life and doing something else for a while, that can help cope with the stress a little bit better. Essentially, it distracts you from stressful stimuli and offers you a break from daily routine, helping you with your sort of negative moods. There's also a variety of neurophysiological mechanisms that have been proposed, like the endorphin theory, like I think a common claim by people who aren't necessarily into exercise science or what have you, is that exercising releases endorphins and then you feel amazing. And that is the singular mechanism at play. In reality, the evidence is a bit more shaky on that front. For instance, you do observe increased endorphin levels after exercise, but some studies suggest that there's not actually any endorphin molecules even crossing the blood-brain barrier, suggesting it wouldn't have an impact on your mood to begin with. So, all that to say, essentially, the exact mechanisms, both from a psychology perspective and from a neurophysiology perspective, aren't fully understood, but the effect of exercise on mood probably, first of all, is very consistent, seems to occur at pretty low doses of exercise, such as only 10 to 20 minutes per bout. And finally, it very likely has to do with a variety of psychological and neurophysiological mechanisms being involved. But yeah, from my perspective, it was just cool to see that even with just 10 to 15 or 20 minutes of exercising in one bout, you can see improvements in your mood.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I definitely have noticed that for myself. One of the best things I've done, like in the past couple of years for both productivity and work vibes, is if I find myself starting to feel fatigued or stressed or overwhelmed, or honestly just like feeling like low energy and unproductive, I just like get up and go for a walk, like about 15 minutes. The block my house is on takes me about 15 minutes to walk around. I just get up, walk around the block, sit back down. I feel subjectively like 40% better and 20% more productive. Those are fake numbers. I just pulled them out of my ass. I have no idea if they're real, but like it does make a tangible, there is a tangible effect every time. And like if it's bad weather, I might just like get up and stretch for like 10 minutes or do a set of push-ups or something. And without fail, it does help me focus better when I get back to work, and also improve my mood and kind of pull me out of the work doldrums. So yeah, the 10 to 30 minute thing definitely makes sense to me. Like in my experience, it really doesn't take all that long.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. And just to echo that, one, I do the exact same thing, funnily enough. But two, I found that also applies to lifting. Like if on a given day I'm quite busy and I'm like, I'm supposed to train today, but I'm not sure I have the time. And oftentimes those busy days might correlate somewhat with how stressed I feel or how negative my mood might be. If I am able to squeeze in even like a 10, 15, 20, 30-minute session that does very appreciably lift my mood, pun intended. So yeah, just even when it comes to lifting weights, I do think the effects of just like 20 to 30 minutes or whatever of lifting are underappreciated when it comes to your mood, health, and everything else. Pack, anything to add?
I'll be invoicing you for using the term minimum dose. And minimum dose, once again, you can make gains. Let's throw lengthened partials in there somehow as well. Minimum dose lengthened partials, mental health, physical health, gains. What else do you need? It's 2024. Things couldn't be simpler. 10 minutes of half reps and you're, a new person. Bigger, stronger, healthier, and more mentally healthier. Yeah, there we go.
Beautiful. Hey, you're halfway there with lengthened partials. Halfway there. I see your.
Oh, that's bad.
Indeed.
That's bad.
That was very bad.
Oh, yeah. I'm a bad pun enjoyer, but that's.
I'm sorry.
I guess
I had to do
entendre. It. Yeah. You know what? I don't like it, but I respect it. I respect it.
There you go.
I had to throw it in there. Game recognized game. So now we've kind of touched on the research on exercising more broadly and your mood. So exercising acutely seems to improve your mood. The effect seems to last for up to 24 hours after exercising. It does a variety of things from increasing sort of positive emotions like enthusiasm, excitement, etc., decreasing more negative emotions like irritability and so forth. And those effects seemingly can be had with a relatively low dose of like 10 to 20 minutes of even just moderate intensity exercise. So even on busier days, you can still get something in. So as far as acutely enhancing your mood, exercise definitely seems to be a viable option. Importantly, though, that is not the only evidence we have for exercising and improving your overall mental health. On the one hand, you could argue that these acute effects are important because if you then, build up to a routine of working out or exercising 3 times a week or 5 times a week, you could essentially get that 24-hour effect 3 to 5 times a week, and that could lead to an overall improvement in your mood across the week, and that can really add up, right? And that's one way of looking at it. Equally, there is also research looking at the chronic effects of exercise on a variety of conditions. So first, I wanted to touch on the effects of exercise overall for a variety of conditions before then later moving into lifting. Because just to give a spoiler, when it comes to lifting specifically, we do have substantially fewer studies looking at the effects of lifting on mental health. There's still enough to have some confidence in the findings, but there's just not quite as many as for aerobic exercise or just endurance exercise more broadly. So first, we have a meta-analysis on the effects of exercise on depressive symptoms, both within people who had diagnosed major depressive disorder or just people who had depressive symptoms which were validated using an inventory, typically. Now, both within individuals with major depressive disorder and in people with just depressive symptoms, so not quite clinically relevant levels of depression, exercise seemed to have relatively large effects. So in terms of effect size, the overall standardized mean difference was 0.95, which would be classified as a large effect size. When a subgroup analysis was performed for comparing resistance training to aerobic training to a combination of both, effect sizes were pretty large and pretty similar for lifting weights and for aerobic training, around an effect size of 1, and quite a bit lower when you combined both or performed concurrent training. That is a relatively consistent finding within the evidence for a variety of aspects of mental health, where both lifting and aerobic training seem to improve mental health similarly. But then typically with concurrent training, effects are a bit more mixed, or the effects tend to be a bit smaller. The evidence around that isn't super clear as to why. I couldn't tell you for sure why that is, but it is a relatively consistent effect. Importantly, the effect remained large when it came to depressive symptoms, whether, again, we're talking about individuals with clinically relevant major depressive disorder or not, and also in the context of supervised versus unsupervised exercise interventions. So it seemed to be that just the act of exercising was a big part of it, and the act of supervision, like for example, if you have a class leader or you're doing just group exercise or what have you, didn't seem to be quite as relevant. So specifically, when it comes to depression, it seems like exercise can reduce symptomology a fair amount. And that is, broadly speaking, the trend with other conditions as well. There are a few other meta-analyses, for example, in schizophrenia patients, in people at risk for dementia and Alzheimer's disease, for example, and just other stuff as well, like in people with insomnia, it seems to improve sleep. Broadly speaking, exercising seems to be beneficial for a variety of conditions. We can go into each individual study one by one, if you think that's appropriate, Greg and Pack, or we can just kind of give overall takeaways from each study in different populations. What do you think?
I think general overview is fine. Everything referenced here will be linked in the show notes, so I think that is sufficient.
Cool.
And yeah, I don't think we necessarily need to go super in depth into everything.
Cool. Sounds good.
I did want to potentially like comment on, or maybe just throw out a hot take about the resistance versus aerobic versus mixed, with smaller effects generally being seen with combination exercise. I wonder. So like the thing about this particular meta-analysis, and for that matter, a fair number of meta-analyses that compare resistance versus aerobic training versus a mix of the two on various outcomes, is that they are often, this is the case in terms of like this meta-analysis, and this is generally the case for a lot of meta-analyses that do this. They're kind of a little bit comparing apples and oranges, where, for instance, a lot of the meta-analyses that listeners of this podcast will be familiar with tend to take what I would call like an apples to apples approach to meta-analysis. Like if you're interested in the impact of training volume on muscle growth, the studies included are going to be studies where you have two groups that do the same general type of exercise, like they're matched for intensity, they're doing the same lifts, same tempo, same general training prescription, except one is doing more volume than the other. And so things are equated, and you can see, hey, when we equate all of these things except for volume, in this group of like 20 studies, like within studies, like everything's equated except for volume. Do we see that volume, like higher volumes, lead to more muscle growth? So that's like that type of setup of meta-analysis, I think leads to like pretty reliable results. Like it's doing what you want a meta-analysis to do. Like it is isolating the particular variable of interest for making the comparison that you're interested in. For this type of meta-analysis, ultimately you're going to have one pool of studies that is comparing resistance training versus a wait list or usual care. You're going to have another set of studies comparing aerobic training versus wait list or usual method of care. You're going to have another set of studies comparing combined resistance and aerobic training with either people being on a wait list or usual standards of care. And so you're effectively doing three separate meta-analyses and just comparing the effect sizes between the three. and there may be some overlap. Like there may be a handful of studies that do both aerobic training and resistance training within the same study, or you have like one resistance training arm and one combined arm, but they're relatively independent. And when you have a situation like that, differences in effect sizes noted between, say, resistance training and combined training, or between aerobic training and combined training, you can't be quite as confident that the differences in effect size are due to differences in the efficacy of the interventions themselves, because the characteristics of the studies going into those analyses can be quite different. So just as, I haven't dug into like every individual study in this meta to know if this is the case, but just kind of like tossing a couple possibilities out there. In this meta-analysis, they found that studies with a lower risk of bias tended to report like somewhat lower effect sizes overall. And they found that the studies in people with depressive symptoms, but not major depressive disorder, tended to have like lower effect sizes than the studies in people with major depressive disorder. Like all of the effect sizes were positive regardless of those things, but those general trends were observed. So it is possible, like I don't know if this is the case, but like, if the studies that did combined resistance and aerobic training, if maybe they were disproportionately not in patients with major depressive disorder, because the researchers were thinking like, well, like people who have major depressive disorder, maybe it could be counterproductive for them to do too much exercise. So like, let's not have them do both aerobic and resistance training. Let's just have them do one or the other. And so like you wind up with a set of studies where people who are the most likely to have the largest effect sizes are only doing resistance training or only doing aerobic training, and the people who are maybe generally less depressed and therefore on the scales being used just have less room to improve for a large effect size to be reported. Those might be the subjects who are disproportionately likely to be in studies that use combined aerobic and resistance training. And so then if you just compared effect sizes, it would appear that combined training is less effective than either in isolation, but it could just be because you're dealing with studies that use like different populations and different like experimental designs. So yeah, like you're kind of comparing apples to oranges, I guess. Anyway, all of which is to say, I'm open to the idea that combined training might be less effective for mental health outcomes than either only resistance training or only aerobic training. But until there are more studies that like do directly make that comparison with the same experimental setup and in the same population, where, studies where it's like a resistance training arm, an aerobic training arm, and a combined arm, and you have like enough of those studies to meta-analyze, that's what I would need to see to be like relatively confident in the precise like point estimates to make comparisons between the forms of exercise. Until then, if resistance and aerobic training both kind of seem to be generally similarly effective, my prior is that the combination of the two is also similarly effective. And I'm open to that not being the case, but the sorts of metas that we have so far, I don't think are sufficient to make those sorts of inferences about the general magnitudes of the benefits.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. That's why I didn't put too fine of a point on it. It's ultimately always when you're dealing with a design, or rather a set of studies that may have looked at certain types of exercise more than others. In this case, I think there were likely a lot more studies for aerobic training versus even resistance training versus specifically combining both. You have a lot less confidence even in the findings. For one, obviously, if the study didn't compare those two interventions, that is one issue. But also specifically if there's fewer studies looking at combined aerobic and resistance training, which there generally tend to be. Like, that's kind of how the evidence goes, is there's the most studies on aerobic training, then on resistance training, and then on combined. then generally you have less confidence the fewer studies you have on a topic.
Yeah, in this case, there were 30 on aerobic, 7 on resistance, and 10 on mixed.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, like resistance training, the pooled effect size was
minus 1.04, I think.
Yeah. I was I looking at the wrong thing? Maybe.
Either way, just to touch on the participants with clinically relevant MDD versus just depressive symptoms thing, across the evidence, not just this meta-analysis, that trend is relatively inconsistent. In fact, there's one meta-analysis that we'll discuss later on briefly, where, if anything, a larger effect was seen in people who didn't have clinical depressive disorder, just depressive symptoms. So I wouldn't, there's certain findings within this evidence that I wouldn't cling on too tightly. The combination of aerobic training and resistance training being slightly worse potentially, I wouldn't cling on too tightly. I don't think there's something to worry about there. Likewise with potentially seeing a much larger effect in only people with clinically relevant symptoms, I think you don't need to worry too much about whether you strictly fall into the category of having clinical major depressive disorder or you're just experiencing depressive symptoms. Either way, it's going to be quite beneficial, and it's not super clear whether the effect is going to be much more meaningful in one population versus the other.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And to be clear, I wasn't trying to imply that like you're making firm claims about combined exercise being less effective, but just given the note you made, I know how some people listening to the podcast kind of like take little comments like that. And so I felt like it was worth drilling down into that a little bit, just so people would know, like, hey, don't take that too literally.
Indeed. It turns out that adding cardio to your lifting is making you more depressed. You know, that would be the wrong conclusion to take from this.
I mean, there's plenty of lifters that will agree with that.
It's true.
Joking aside, sorry, I wanted to hear your thoughts on this meta recommending that exercise could be a legitimate treatment option. Obviously, just want to hear what your thoughts are as non-medical advice individuals. But it was cool to see, joking aside, that it was recommended that exercise could be recommended as a legitimate treatment option. I think that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's not a doctor and is not prescribing things for specific health outcomes, my take is that I don't have one. Yeah. Yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm going to go...
fully leave that up to the professionals.
Yeah, that's fair enough. This is not meant as advice to anyone. This is more so from like if I were in a public health position, sort of thought experiment. Obviously, lifting seems to be efficacious or lifting and exercise in general at helping with symptoms of a variety of conditions. And it's relatively cheap and cost effective, but ultimately with exercising, just as with weight loss, for example, or dieting, you see that people typically struggle to adhere. And so that's a pretty big limitation of this intervention as being like the thing that's going to solve everything all the time. So yeah, it's very hopeful and optimistic. Like exercise is being framed as medicine for a lot of stuff nowadays, but equally it's difficult to get many people to stick to things. And that's one of the biggest obstacles in using this in the first place. So yes, not medical advice. Keep that in mind.
Thank you, doctor.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you will often hear if you talk to people with depression is like, I don't know, like I don't know if exercise is being like prescribed. Like there's a difference between a doctor recommending something and prescribing something. So in terms of terminology, I don't know if exercise is being like prescribed for people with depression, but just from talking to people with depression, I do know that that's an almost universal recommendation already. Like, hey, like you should try exercising. That'll probably help you out. I do think that if it could be prescribed, if the experts decide like, oh yeah, it warrants that, like it being a prescribable thing, there would be benefits that would come along with that, like I think if something is prescribed, then it becomes reimbursable by insurance. And so, you could maybe like get a trainer or join a gym without any out-of-pocket costs or as large of out-of-pocket costs. So like there are like additional benefits that would come along with it being like a prescribable thing. But where I was going with this is like, I do know that it seems to be almost universally recommended already. And one of the things that people with depression often say is like, yeah, like I know that it's a good thing, or like my doctor tells me that it's a good thing. But one of the things that goes along with depression is like really low energy, like, the thought and idea of exercising feels like so just fucking tiring and like overwhelming that even if it would help them, it like there's a big hill to get over to get started. So I just wanted to like make note of that, because like I do one of the things that I'm sensitive to is like people who do have like legitimate serious depression. I do think a lot of people in their lives tell them like, hey, you should go out and exercise. Like, I don't think that that's like a novel thing. And they will often get frustrated by being like, yeah, like I know, but also I have depression, so it's fucking hard. So I just wanted to kind of like call that out to like acknowledge that, yeah, like exercise does seem to be beneficial. It doesn't seem like you need all that much of it, but also, yeah, like if you're dealing with depression, I don't want this to come across as like flippant, like in amount and volume of exercise that may seem like, oh, that's like very easy. Everyone should be able to do that without any issue whatsoever. I think that that's often framed as like, well, you should be able to do this without any issue whatsoever. And like, if you're trying to like treat your depression, like, why aren't you? Are you being lazy? And we're very much not saying that. Like we understand and acknowledge, yeah, like it makes shit a lot tougher. Like you could know that it's beneficial, but also, yeah, like it's hard,
That was the sort of response I was fishing for. I like how you said I won't give a response and then gave the exact response I wanted to get.
Cool.
4D chess.
You've been tricked.
Nothing I said in there is intended to be used to prescribe, treat, prevent, or cure any disease. Just
their lawsuits have already been filed, man. We're not saving this.
It's over.
Shit.
Nice.
To get back on topic, the results of how exercise tends to impact depression and depressive symptoms are pretty similar when it comes to other conditions as well. So, in the research at least, for example, there is a positive effect of exercising on psychiatric symptoms in schizophrenia patients, where a systematic review of 20 studies found significant reductions in psychiatric symptoms in patients with schizophrenia when using 90 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise per week. Similarly, when it comes to dementia and Alzheimer's, a systematic review meta-analysis of 58 studies found that a higher level of physical activity per week was found to be associated with a lower incidence of all-cause dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Importantly, the largest risk reduction, the association between risk of having dementia or getting dementia rather, and Alzheimer's disease, was attenuated most with around 2,000 units of MET minutes per week. Now, that unit doesn't mean anything to anyone, so I'll briefly explain. Different activities are assigned different metabolic equivalents, or essentially how much oxygen just how much oxygen is being consumed during the activity. So one MET, as we discussed in 2 episodes ago, I think, one MET is 3.5 milliliters of oxygen consumption per kilogram of body weight per minute. So essentially, it's just a measure of exercise intensity. In this case, the largest reduction in risk of getting dementia or Alzheimer's disease was seen at 2,000 MET minutes per week. So just for some context, walking typically has a MET equivalent of like around 3.5, depending on the pace and so forth. And so if we're talking about 2,000 net minutes, we might be talking about 60 minutes of brisk walking at 3 mets. Because that would be 60 minutes times 3 mets would give you around 180. And so if we're doing that for, say, 10 hours a week, that would give you around the maximum reduction observed in this study. So you don't need to exercise a ton. Like with 10 hours, you essentially observe the maximum benefit. But in general, it seems like physical activity might be protective of future mental illness, or at least that association appears to be present within the research. There's other research suggesting the same goes for depression, where an association between physical activity and risk of depression study, basically looking at a data set of around 200,000 participants, a greater level of physical activity was associated with a lower relative risk of eventually developing major depressive disorder. In this study, the largest reduction in risk of developing major depressive disorder in the future was seen with around 15 met hours per week. So we're talking about 5-ish hours of walking, for example, per week, roughly achieving that activity level, and you observe quite a large reduction of around 25% in your risk of potentially developing major depressive disorder in the future. Again, this is an association, and there's plenty of other things that could explain it. It's not exactly a randomized controlled trial, but it is worth noting that physical activity and exercising more broadly could potentially reduce the risk of developing future mental illness, specifically in the case of Alzheimer's or dementia or major depressive disorder in the future. Finally, the same appears to go for anxiety as well. There was another study looking at that topic. I won't essentially repeat the same findings for yet another potential disorder. But the final thing I want to touch on when it came to...
good? Is it also good for this one?
Hey, it's also good for this one. Shocking.
What a twist. What a twist.
I know.
That's awesome.
How are we going to clickbait this podcast episode? It's lifting is good for your mental health, question mark?
Free mental health advice.
By medical experts.
By medical experts.
Have you heard of Betteridge's law of headlines?
I have not.
It's wrong. Like, I don't know why people roll with this, but it's the idea that, like, if you see a headline that ends in a question mark, the answer is no. Because it's like, well, most of the time, if you see that from like a big newspaper, they are like basically it's like an OG form of clickbait, you know, like that's something you're going to put above the fold on A1, and you're going to pose an audacious question that the reader walking by the newsstand will be like, no, like obviously that's wrong. Why is this a question? Are people saying this thing? And then you read the article and the answer is no. It's wrong so many times that it shouldn't be a law. It should be Betteridge's heuristic of headlines. But anyway, where I was going with that is we could just lean into it and just be like, exercise debunked for mental health benefits, ? And then if people get mad, just be like, dude, it's fucking Betteridge. Like, if you thought that we were going to come down and say, yes, it has been debunked, that's your fault for not knowing this obscure little heuristic that developed during like the fucking yellow journalism era. What's wrong with you? But no, I don't think we should actually do that.
I mean, honestly, like when it comes to hooks framed as questions, my own heuristic is essentially thinking of whether or not the person is generally conveying information accurately. Like, if I'm watching someone or consuming information and generally the provider of that information tends to try their best to be honest and truthful in their representation of information, and they're asking a question, I will assume there's some uncertainty, or like they asked a question because they couldn't put it as a statement, and therefore the answer is no most of the time. But if it's like a less trustworthy source of information, usually the question mark can literally just be added to anything, and it could be either or. So yeah, I kind of see why the rule came to be based on how much I trust the information source. But Yeah, hey, it turns out, yet again, physical activity, it seems to be linked with a lower risk of developing generalized anxiety and disorder in the future. So
nice.
There you go.
I know you know this, Milo, and also I know 95% of our listeners know this already, but standard caveat whenever we discuss epidemiological findings like this, of the metas that Milo just talked about, I think one of them, the one looking at exercise interventions for the actual attempt to improve clinical symptoms for people with depression, that is a meta-analysis of the types of trials that one could use to potentially try to draw causal inferences. The rest, they're associations. Like Milo did call that out, but just to be like crystal clear, like entirely clear about that, there are certainly plenty of confounders, like people who get more exercise also tend to be people that live in safer neighborhoods. They are often people with higher socioeconomic status. There might be a little bit of inverse causation where if you already have a touch of schizophrenia or a touch of anxiety, maybe like the shortness of breath that comes with exercise can exacerbate feelings of anxiety if you already have it at like a subclinical level and it eventually develops. And so maybe if you're like predisposed to panic or anxiety disorders, you are less likely to exercise. But so there's all of these things, and I do suspect that since we're seeing similar associations across a lot of different aspects of mental health, like my gut feeling is that there is probably a causal link with a lot of these things where if you exercise, that does reduce your risk. Like that's what I think. That's what I suspect. But the magnitudes of relative risk reductions observed, it is important to put the caveat on there that there are plenty of relevant confounders that are present here, and like I suspect that it is a causal relationship, but also I kind of suspect that the like causal benefits of exercise are probably a little smaller than the relative risk reductions that have been observed in these meta-analyses, because I mean just because of like all of those confounders that would be like pretty common to a lot of these different outcomes and would tend to cluster. So that's kind of my take on this, but
Yeah.
I could be very wrong. There could be no causal relationship whatsoever, or it could be all causal. Who knows?
I think it's entirely reasonable, and I think that whenever you're interpreting research that isn't designed to infer causality for sure, you can kind of look at adjacent bodies of evidence and inform your understanding through them. Like, for example, if in this case we're looking at epidemiological data, and we're like, okay, there seems to potentially be something here. Obviously, it's not perfect for inferring causality whatsoever, but we have randomized control trials in populations with these symptoms that seem to indicate that this behavior or intervention improves symptoms. Okay, well, that lends some credence to the idea that what you're observing within the epidemiological data might be causal as well. It kind of reminds me of, I'm sure you've heard of the Bradford Hill criteria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of that, where the Bradford Hill criteria are essentially a set of criteria that can be used to determine whether or not it might be more or less reasonable to infer causality from correlation. Mm-hmm. So it's things like temporality. If you're thinking that the variable A is causing outcome B, for example, then variable A must come in time before variable B happens. For example, if you think that sleep is causing you to get a painful neck in the morning, and you always get a painful neck in the morning after sleeping, then temporality is you first get exposed to the intervention, which is sleeping, and then you get the outcome. So there's a correlation. Every time you sleep, you seem to have a painful neck, but the temporality of those events also lines up with causality. Essentially, the effect follows the cause, right? There's a variety of other criteria, like, for example, the strength, like whether or not there's a dose-response relationship, where the more of the causative variable you apply, the more of an effect you tend to see, whether there's consistency, whether it's plausible biologically, which could be kind of likened to looking at other bodies of evidence here when it comes to epidemiological versus more controlled randomized trials. Just a variety of factors that can be considered a little bit when you're like, okay, we don't have solid randomized controlled trials here, but can we still see whether or not this correlation or association we're seeing is likely to be something causative? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm aware of that. Like the thing I just wanted to like put a pin in is just that you know, I mean, the general concept that like positive and negative things tend to cluster in epidemiological research, like people who tend to exercise tend to be different than people who don't exercise. Like if you had like a full if you had data on everyone and you're just like, hey, who exercises regularly and who doesn't, and then you just looked at the characteristics of those two groups, like there would generally be differences in like rates of adoption of like other health promoting behaviors. There would generally tend to be socioeconomic differences. There would generally tend to be differences in areas people live in and whether it kind of makes you feel safe and secure or not, or if you feel more precarious, at least in the US, like access to the medical system or not, like all of those things. And like, you can try to statistically adjust for as many confounders as you can that you have data on, but like, you're not going to have data on everything. And there will still be, like, even when you adjust for everything you can, there will still be like residual confounding there, which is why I'm saying like I'm not being like a full like nihilist here. Like I do suspect that these are causal relationships. I'm just saying that like due to those factors, you can both meet all of the Bradford Hill criteria, which like I don't know that all of these do, but like even if they did, you can meet all of the Bradford Hill criteria and establish with like a high degree of confidence that you're dealing with a causal relationship, but still that does not then therefore imply that the relative risk differences observed in epidemiological research map one-to-one on the individual risk reductions that would be observed if someone did the thing, like that's all I'm saying. Like my take is I do think that there are probably some causal effects here. But I just wanted to make the note that if we say like exercise is associated with a 30% lower relative risk at X number of met minutes per week, that is, it's based on observational data, and like a 30% difference in relative risk is not identical and should not be interpreted to directly mean that your personal risk goes down 30%. Just because like due to all of those confounders, even if it is causal, you shouldn't have like an enormous amount of confidence in like the precision of that effect estimate. And if you're dealing with residual confounding, the benefits that an individual would accrue would tend to be smaller than the trend observed in the observational research. That's all I'm saying. Like,
no, for sure, I agree.
Purely making a statistical point.
I agree. Ultimately, the difficult thing with these health behaviors equally is that we don't typically have a ton of solid randomized control trials to draw on, and so oftentimes much of the research we have to draw on is not designed to infer causality, and we still ultimately need to decide, okay, what do we want to do day to day to maximize our healthful living or whatever, to the extent that we can change that. So yeah, I think it's like, I certainly agree that the directionality should be considered. Like if there is an effect there and it's positive, that's worth keeping in mind. But whether it's going to be a 30% reduction or a 15% reduction or whatever is pretty hard to quantify and probably not something you need to be overly hung up over. Cool, awesome. Just to briefly touch on the final study I had noted down here, which is essentially the impact of physical activity on objective sleep of people with insomnia. We had a previous couple of episodes on sleep, so this ties in pretty nicely. In those episodes, we basically just mentioned that, hey, exercising, it's good for your sleep, but we didn't really look at insomnia specifically. Now, in this meta-analysis, they looked at 15 studies in people suffering of chronic insomnia, which is generally defined as at least 6 months of disrupted sleep. And they only included studies with objective sleep assessments, so polysomnography or actigraphy. And basically, exercising seemed to improve objective markers of sleep in people with insomnia. So even if you're currently dealing with chronic insomnia, there is a chance that you would benefit in terms of your sleep in exercising. Even as we discussed last time, even if you don't necessarily feel your greatest if you're acutely sleep deprived or dealing with chronic insomnia, there does seem to be a decent chance that exercising could improve your sleep. So yeah, that is broadly it on exercising at large for mental health. I'm quickly going to give an overview of the research on lifting specifically. As I mentioned up top on this episode, there is much less research on lifting specifically. Most of the research on exercising for mental health, when it comes to the association between exercising and preventing or reducing risk of developing different disorders in the future, or managing symptomology, or even boosting mood acutely, most of that research tends to be on aerobic exercise. Importantly, I'm going to give you the cliff instead of going into each individual study here. Lifting weights seems to be similarly effective at improving symptomology of a variety of different conditions as aerobic exercise. It doesn't seem to be much more effective or much less effective based on the effect sizes being seen. In the studies that typically compare the two for a different variety of different things, the effect sizes tend to be similar. The few studies I wanted to touch on, one was specifically looking at strength training in adolescents, and another specifically looking at strength training in older adults. So in adolescents, essentially aged around 12 to 18, if I recall correctly, and in older adults aged 60 or older. In both of these studies, both of these were meta-analyses. They observed relatively large effects for depression, aka depressive symptoms, anxiety and anxiety symptoms, both in adolescents and also in older adults. So most of the research we do have is in just sort of young and middle-aged adults, but it does seem like potentially the effects of exercise on mental health do likely generalize even to adolescents and to older adults as well, which is good news, suggesting that even if you're not in the typically studied demographic, that you'll probably still observe an improvement in your mental health. The one other meta-analysis I wanted to cover briefly was a meta-analysis on the efficacy of resistance training in adults with depressive symptoms. Now, basically the findings here are exactly the same as every other study I mentioned, which, hey, shocker. Exercising, it seemed to be helpful in reducing symptoms of depression. But one interesting finding, and I'm not going to read too deeply into this one, just because it is just one meta-analysis, but one interesting finding they had was that the amount of strength gained by participants through strength training didn't seem to significantly moderate the results of the improvement in depressive symptoms being observed. So in this specific meta-analysis, the studies included were randomized controlled trials, and essentially the amount of strength being gained by participants in engaging in strength training didn't seem to meaningfully impact the improvement in depressive symptoms. So this kind of jives with my personal bias, at least. Like, I can't say that I've seen too much of it in practice or that I can make a strong claim as to this, but I don't think that your progress within the gym is the main thing in promoting your mental health. So even if you're not making many gains in the gym, if you're consistently lifting, I do think you're probably getting most, if not all, of the mental health benefits on average. So yeah, just because you're a low responder in terms of your experience in the gym, like you don't necessarily gain muscle as easily or gain strength as easily as the next person, doesn't mean you won't observe a meaningful mental health benefit from lifting weights. That's kind of my hopeful takeaway from this research, but I'm interested to see what Greg and Pack have to say about this.
I mean, I find that very plausible. Every form of exercise that I've like taken up and focused on for a while has generally tended to be good for me, I guess. And that includes things that I respond very well to, like lifting, and things that I don't respond as well to, aka cardio. Like during the times that I've done more dedicated cardio, I think I'm a relatively low responder to it. Like my aerobic fitness improves, but like not by all that much. Certainly not as much as my strength improves when I lift. So I think I'm like a moderate to low responder for that. But also, if I do it consistently, it also makes me feel good. You know, I find that very plausible. Like the I can't think of many proposed mechanisms by which exercise would improve physical performance that would like directly map onto mental health or like brain structure or function. Like that feels to me like it should be two distinct sets of mechanisms. So it's not surprising to me that outcomes in one domain aren't predictive of outcomes in the other.
I mean, I agree. The one thing that came to mind a little bit was, as I mentioned earlier, one of the proposed mechanisms on the sort of psychological framework level for exercise improving mood and sort of chronically improving mental health is an improvement in self-efficacy, or essentially seeing yourself progress over time can help you feel more confident and have a higher level of self-esteem, which then improves your mental health overall. And that's the only way in which I could see how much strength you gain in the gym kind of impacting your mental health, right? And equally anecdotally, like for people who are deep in the game, I guess, this is not the topic of these studies. Like I don't think many people who are hardcore lifters were in these studies, but I guess equally for people who are hardcore lifters who've been training for quite a while, not making any gains, I have seen many people at least get acutely upset about it. So I don't know. I could kind of see a alternate universe Greg Knuckles arguing with me right now about how actually you do need 20-inch arms to be happy, and otherwise you will never make it.
Yeah, I mean, that's just science and basic biology, but
it's true.
I wanted to add my 2 cents there, but Greg, I see you're ready to respond first, so I'll take a step back and let you do that.
I'm not. I think you guys think that I'm wanting to say things times.
It's
that
your
I'm
mouth
not.
Movement.
I think I just have a kind of expressive face.
Nice.
It's true.
I'm chewing gum. That might look like I'm preparing my mouth to say something.
Valid.
So,
but
the
no,
first thing,
you're good. Take it away.
Thank you. The first thing I wanted to say is that based obviously off of what we discussed here, and we've also touched on exercise and lifting and health in general, and obviously muscle growth, strength. But I think that unless you're a competitive athlete or you're somebody whose livelihood depends on being as muscular or as strong as possible, doing whatever is fun in the gym should be the way to go, without feeling any guilt about whether what you're doing is necessarily optimal or suboptimal, obviously within reason, right? Because I can hear Milo arguing back that, hey, if you're not making any gains, then that may, backfire in the form of you not being so happy. So yeah, sure. If you're that one weirdo that likes doing only, I don't know, static holds and throwing a Bosu ball against the wall, sure, maybe doing something else that is more effective for strength and hypertrophy is probably a good idea. But overall, getting in the gym and just having fun within reason, I think is a solid approach for a lot of people out there, without necessarily either following a very strict program or doing anything that requires them to dread being in the gym. That was one thing.
I think that's pretty reasonable. Again, I was kind of grasping at straws and trying to red team myself about my bias a little bit. to see whether maybe there is something where the people who get stronger should be happier, or aka just see larger improvements in their mental health. But yeah, by and large, I tend to think that you're both right on that one.
Yeah.
Just to finally close it off, and just to kind of close a chapter on the research side of things before we head into some Q&A, there was one study that tried to sort of roughly compare the data of different modes of exercise for reducing depressive symptoms. Now, this was a network meta-analysis, which does suffer some of the limitations that Greg mentioned earlier when it comes to not necessarily always comparing apples to apples. But in this meta-analysis, specifically set out to look at the research on a variety of different modes of exercise and looking at how large of an effect do they tend to have. And essentially, like, the effects of strength training on depressive symptoms were largely on par with the effects of other forms of exercise. So, for example, walking had an effect size of around 0.6, 0.7, whereas strength training had an effect size of about 0.5, 0.55, or thereabouts. So the effect sizes tend to be similar between whether it's strength training, aerobic exercise, walking or jogging. The main thing seems to mostly be exercising in some form. It doesn't need to be a super high dosage, seemingly. It doesn't need to be a specific type of exercise even. It seems like a variety of types of exercise are similarly effective. So yeah, like, it seems to be pretty good news, so that if you're a seasoned lifter and lifting is your exercise pill of choice, feel free to keep taking that pill. If you have a different mode of activity that you prefer, you can keep taking that one. And the effects do appear to be pretty similar, irrespective of the exact modality that you use. But yeah, that wraps up, I think, all of the research. The big TLDR from that, as I prefaced up front, is exercising. It's likely good for your mental health for a variety of disorders, seemingly, both potentially for reducing the likelihood of eventually getting that disorder, for acutely improving your mood if you're having a rough day or dealing with a stressor, and also just for potentially reducing symptomology if you're already dealing with some sort of disorder. But yeah, exercise by and large just seems to be a good thing, TM. Yeah, anything you guys want to add before we head into some Q&A?
Nothing is immediately coming to mind. One just kind of like technical. One thing that I just kind of want to raise, I guess, about the BMJ network meta-analysis that you mentioned is, like, one take that I frequently saw from fitness industry people after this was published was essentially, like, exercise is better than SSRIs. Like, you should not take, kind of like a naturalistic thing, like, you should not take psychiatric medication. Exercise is all you need, blah, 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 whatever. And, like, this coming from people who, I don't know, as far as I'm aware, their only qualification is just like a personal training certification. Anyway, yeah, that I don't think that's a valid take. SSRIs are unhelpful for some people, and they help a lot of people. And if your doctor says it's likely to help you, and you've used them, and they seem to help your symptoms, yeah, it's good. It's fine. And if you come across people discussing this study and cosplaying as psychiatrists, block them. You don't need that in your life. Those are people going way outside their lane. Like, it's particularly galling to me, I guess, because, like, I don't know, man. Like, there are branches of medicine that are, like, more or less closely related to, like, exercise expertise, like where the physiology is, like, closer or more distant. And I think people should stay in their lane generally, but, like, I understand it a little more when people start veering out of their lane a little bit in some circumstances. But when it's like, yeah, you're you tell people to whether they should do sets of 5 or sets of 10 for a living, and you're gonna weigh in on like psychiatric drugs. Like, nah, like get the fuck out of here. Like, that's so far outside your lane. Anyway, I just wanted to make that note about this particular meta-analysis, because that was a pretty common take that I saw. And I think that that's bad and probably dangerous.
Yeah, I think that's a common thing where, like, the only reason we're talking about this topic now is because we do engage in exercise occasionally, and our audience does exercise occasionally. But I think that when we start telling people whether or not to take SSRIs is when we may have overstepped our boundaries a little bit, or our scope. Cool.
Yeah,
awesome.
That's something between you and your doctor.
Yeah. The same with the phrase exercise is, or lifting is therapy, which I get in a non-formal or loose way, that, oh, I have fun when I lift and I feel good after. But, actually consulting a professional and seeing if you would benefit from actual therapy is probably a good thing to do.
You heard it here first. Dr. Pack, big mental health advocate. He strikes again.
7 years, psychologist.
Hey, same here. Gang. Anyways, psychologist gang. Q&A.
First question from Christian. He asks, in a situation where stress and exhaustion is the mental health problem, how should you go about finding balance, the appropriate volume, intensity, frequency, etc., with your training efforts to be helpful and not simply add more exhaustion? Probably not a question with a simple answer, but perhaps worthy of some discussion.
I'm going to direct this question straight to Mr. Minimum Dose to take it for us.
Thank you. I think the answer can be relatively simple. So starting with very low, based on what we discussed, even 10 minutes of exercise can be beneficial for mental health. But looking at the strength and hypertrophy literature, if you were to start with just like 4 to 6 sets per muscle group or per lift per week, and start very low, even lower than that, see how that feels and whether that's something you can actually recover from, and then adjust upwards or downwards from there. I think that would be a great way for you to at least feel that, hey, I'm still making some gains, not just maintaining. And it's likely to have a positive impact on your mental health too, without feeling too overwhelming and feeling like, oh, now I have to commit to this 2-hour training session program or whatever. So starting super low and then taking it from there.
Yeah, no, I wholly agree. The thing with this question as well is that I assume Christian is a lifter, in which case it's also worth reiterating that, hey, according to Mr. Minimum Dose over here, you can still see progress in the gym even with just half an hour. Maybe not half an hour, but around half an hour to maybe a couple hours in the gym a week. And so even when it comes to your hypertrophy and strength, let alone your mental health, which sounds like it's ultimately the more immediate and meaningful problem here, even when it comes to hypertrophy and strength, even just spending an hour or two in the gym per week might still be sufficient to at least see some progress. And in a situation like the one you're describing, where stress and exhaustion are a problem, and you likely don't have a ton of available time and mental bandwidth to dedicate to training, I think that you can still see meaningful improvements in mental health, size, strength, with just an hour or two in the gym per week.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that I think that this is something that is like trackable, that you could add to your training journal. Like one of the things that has been helpful for me when I'm lifting more for like quality of life than for some particular outcome I'm pursuing, like muscle growth, strength, like some sort of like trackable thing, and I'm more just trying to feel good. one thing that can be helpful is making note of like how you're feeling at the end of a training session, and then your energy levels, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours post training. And you'll be able, I think, to kind of figure out what sensation at the end of a workout is for you most reliably associated with the like energy levels that you're trying to pursue after the gym. Like, and it, you could try to do it in like a session RPE type of way where you're trying to like quantify it with numbers. Or for me personally, I tend to like just like much squishier but more descriptive language, because you can feel an amount of tired that you would rate as a 4, but it could be 2 very different 4s, you can feel tired in a way that's like your limbs feel heavy and you feel like physically exhausted, or you could feel tired in a way where like you could do more sets of exercise if you wanted to, but like your motivation and affect is starting to wane. And if you were just putting like a number on it, you could say like similar level of fatigue, similar level of exhaustion. But those two types of sensations may lead to very different feelings and energy levels an hour or two after training. So yeah, I think it's worth like checking in with how you're feeling during and at the end of an exercise session, making note of it, and then seeing, hey, how am I feeling, an hour or 2 hours later? Like, how are my energy levels? And I think you should be able to triangulate for yourself pretty well how you want to feel at the end of a training session to then feel how you want to feel an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 24 hours after your training session. And I think, like, I personally think that getting in touch with those sensations and being able to use that as a marker may be a bit more helpful than like trying to triangulate like a specific average training dose that leads to those outcomes, because that will be kind of, it'll be pretty variable, like the amount of training that improves your energy levels and makes you feel better. If you're exercising after a good night of sleep, or if you're exercising after a bad night of sleep, may be very different. Or, when your stress levels are generally higher or generally lower, it may be very different. But at least for myself, I find that like I know what sensations I want to feel at the end of a workout to continue feeling better the rest of the day. And I think just kind of, that bit of like journaling and note taking to help check in with yourself and create those like associations for yourself, I think can be pretty helpful.
No, I fully agree. And just to go even further, while we do have research suggesting that, hey, exercising helps with your stress, can acutely boost your mood, so on principle, it's probably something you want to engage in most of the time. If you're dealing with like super high stress in the short term, and the idea of engaging in exercise is like causing even more stress, you won't lose all your gains if you take a few days off or a week off, what have you. So the occasional few days off or week off, even though it might not be strictly advisable from the research standpoint, where exercising might actually improve your mood, sometimes it feels more stressful to try to force yourself to do it than to just accept that you're dealing with super high stress for a few days and then you can get back into it. I think that's a reasonable way to navigate this as well. Cool. Do you want to pitch the next question, or do you want me to go ahead?
Nah, I got you. So Nick asks, everyone is talking about lifting for mental health, but I've seen my fair share of people where working out was actually detrimental for mental health. Group class junkies doing 3 classes back to back, toning bunnies doing 2+ hour workouts without any useful intensity, fat loss seekers trying to cardio their way out of a shitty lifestyle or diet, or gym bros avoiding facing their actual life by constantly being in the gym. Would be cool if you could also talk a bit about what research has to say about the dark side of gym life, body image issues, and how the fitness life can take a wrong turn.
Sure. So, up the top, I'm going to say I don't know a ton about the body image research, so I'm not even going to try to speak on that. What I will say is that, one, I think that past a certain amount, most people overestimate potentially how much more of a health benefit more time in the gym will net them most of the time. So I know that Greg has reviewed some research on the podcast before around how much time per week lifting is typically associated with the best health outcomes. And generally that dose response relationship tends to max out pretty early after only a couple hours in the gym per week. Similar things tend to apply with the cardio relationship with health, like physical health, such as all-cause mortality, what have you, or even potentially steps where some research finds benefits up to like 8 to 10,000, whereas other meta-analyses find benefits even higher up to like 15,000 or so. But at some point, the marginal benefit of doing more steps or doing more physical activity does start to diminish. And that probably is the case too with mental health, where I think if you're spending 2 to 3 hours in the gym consistently, I'm not sure if you're getting much more of a, just on average, if that person would be getting much more of a benefit in terms of mental health. There's going to be some variation there where some people genuinely do feel like they get more out of it by spending more time in the gym. But I do think most people overestimate how much time they need to spend in the gym to feel their best, typically. Specifically, I think that this can sometimes, and I'm now speaking as a coach and as an individual who's been training for a while and interacted with many lifters rather than something that I'm couching in the appropriate research. But I do think that chasing maximum hypertrophy, maximum strength, etc., or just really enjoying the lifting journey can sometimes take a bit of a turn where you essentially discard all of your other hobbies and the gym starts sometimes becoming more of an obstacle to other forms of socializing. And I think that when that happens, essentially lifting can sometimes take over your life a little bit. And at that point, it's essentially just a matter of reflecting and thinking, okay, well, I'm spending this much time in the gym. Is it actually what I want to do? Because sometimes it can mean that you're sacrificing opportunities to socialize, opportunities to engage in other hobbies that you might sometimes even find more meaningful. And you can fall into that habit without really even realizing it. So I would say just if you've noticed that you're not feeling your best and that you've started neglecting other parts of your life a lot more as a result of lifting a lot or taking your nutrition super seriously as part of your lifting journey or what have you, it might just be worth reflecting and thinking, okay, is this really what I want? Is this behavior really in line with what I ultimately wish to get out of my spare time, what have you?
Yeah. This was something that we were discussing with Milo a few weeks ago, specifically about the mindset that we as lifters have sort of developed around lifting, and that, hey, this is a non-negotiable thing in our daily lives. But, there comes a point where as an advanced lifter, you could make the argument that, hey, just make sure you go to the gym 2 to 3 times, hit whatever volume landmarks you need to hit in order to still make some progress. But if spending some more time either working, socializing, or doing stuff with your loved ones outside the gym, maybe it's worth giving up that sort of hardcore mentality and that unquestionable dedication so that you can actually feel better mental health wise versus, oh, let me now force the 1 hour in the gym and then be stressed because I could have spent that time doing something else that is more meaningful to me. But I'm used to lifting every day, and I know that I have to because I've told myself that I have to because my identity is a lifter. So yeah, it's something that for the hardcore lifter and exercisers of the podcast, it's worth asking yourself, hey, is it really worth spending that extra time in the gym, or would I be better off not spending it in the gym?
Yeah, I agree with that. I do I do wonder I wonder if that's what the the person asking this question is getting at, because like I think when stuff like this becomes like actually disordered, it is a little beyond the point of sometimes it can be beyond the point of that type of self-reflection actually getting people very far, because they may be able to either like if it's disordered enough, they may not even be able to like recognize that it's a problem. It's just like, no, like, what are you talking about? This is what I want to be doing. Or it's almost like the sort of dynamic that someone might have with an addiction where like they know that it's bad. They don't necessarily want to do it or do it as much as they currently are, but like there's a bit of like a compulsion element to it. And if anything, it could maybe for some people sometime be counterproductive, because like a lot of that is kind of fueled by feelings of like guilt or shame, and then they have something that they do as a way to kind of like retreat from it or get like release from it. And so if you ask them to reflect on this thing that is like already causing them guilt and shame, it can kind of like push them further into it. So yeah, I don't know. I think that like one note I want to make is like, I do think it's important to disambiguate cause and effect a little bit. Like I do think that sometimes I come across the narrative that like getting into the gym and getting into lifting will like increase your risk of developing body image issues or like disordered relationships with exercise or eating disorders or whatever. And then you look at the research and it tends to suggest like, oh no, like exercising tends to have like positive effects on those outcomes. So it could be that, yeah, the general effect is positive, but for a minority of people, for unknown reasons, it can have like a causative negative effect. Or what I kind of think is more likely are, these aren't mutually exclusive. They could both be true, but I think what is more common is maybe people who already have some kind of like disordered psychological symptomology, like find exercise or fitness as like a coping mechanism for a thing that they're already experiencing. Where, you know, like maybe instead of like using drugs to like numb something, they're like, I'll go to the gym. And they're like, ooh, this numbs this thing that I'm trying to numb. And then, you know, they get into it that way. I don't know. Like, don't take any of this like all that seriously. I am like kind of speculating a bit. You know, I'm not an expert in this field. One thing I will note is that like a lot of these things are associated with like other like mental health diagnoses, like you know, like people who overexercise also tend to have like people who have like disordered relationships with exercise also tend to have higher rates of eating disorder, also tend to have higher rates of substance abuse disorders. Like a lot of these things cluster, and are generally just seem to be indicative of people who are kind of struggling more broadly. And like my admittedly extremely non-expert opinion is that people who are already struggling with stuff maybe find fitness related pursuits as like a somewhat healthier coping mechanism than maybe other coping mechanisms they'd go for, but then they pursue it in a manner where it also becomes somewhat unhealthy. But I think that I think that for a lot of people, the cause and effect is kind of like inverted, where people who are already who already probably need some professional help, instead of like doing something else to cope or like self-medicating in some other way, kind of get into the fitness lifestyle as a way to kind of like self-medicate for whatever they're feeling. I again, that could be totally wrong. Not an expert, but that's what my observations tend to suggest, I guess, and my read of the research that I have read in this area.
Hey, to join you in the speculation, I'm going to mention something I didn't think I was going to mention because I was like, I'm really not well read in this, so I won't even mention it. But since we're on topic speculating, back in my undergrad, I did read about a fair bit of research around around exercise dependence, and specifically around primary versus secondary exercise dependence. Essentially, the addiction to exercise, or dependence on exercise, can be thought of as either being primary, that is to say it is the central part of the disorder, or it can be seen as being secondary, that is to say it's a consequence of a different sort of disorder. Like, for example, an eating disorder where you're trying to exercise compulsively as a means to achieve a certain appearance because you have an excessive concern with your appearance or what have you. Generally, at the time, and this was again in my undergrad, so I didn't have a ton of knowledge in the area about how to read papers and what have you, but at the time, the consensus, from what I could tell, was that exercise dependence was almost always, if not always, secondary in nature, which is to say it happened when a sort of eating disorder was at the core of it, or what have you, and that it was rarely just present on its own entirely. Again, this is mostly speculation because it's not an area of the evidence I'm particularly familiar with, but it's worth noting that if you think that you're spending a ton of time in the gym and that you're experiencing many of the things that come with addiction, then it's worth checking if maybe there is not something else there as well. Because oftentimes, as Greg mentioned, those things tend to cluster. So,
Greg, as a fellow ADHDer, did you find yourself enjoying lifting and strength training in particular because of the stimulation of, chasing like little PRs every day and getting like that little, ooh, I'm going to go to the gym today and I'm going to PR something and I'm going to get like a little dopamine hit?
Bro, I think that's like 100% of the reason that like powerlifting clicked so well with me. There's like an exhilaration you get from I'm oftentimes like not entirely present, I guess. If I'm like locked in on a conversation, I'm like 80% locked in on the conversation and 20% mind just kind of wandering. But you're attempting a bench PR. There's a lot of weight over your face. That like that gets you there, like you gotta be very present. And I think that's why I took most to squatting. Like once I got pretty decent at like deadlift and bench, I was just like, I'm getting strong enough at squatting now that if something went like horribly wrong, something really bad could happen, and I love it. And so, I think that was definitely a consideration. I mean, before I got into powerlifting, my favorite sport was basketball, and my favorite sport still is basketball. And it's another one where it's like, it's very stimulating, like 5-on-5, you got to be aware of everything going on the court. Like you're watching your man, but like you need to know where everyone on the other team is, where all of your teammates are, kind of like everything going on. If you have like a lapse in attention, especially on defense or even on offense, like if you're just not looking at a pass and it like hits you in the face, like lapses in attention are like very obvious and can be like quite embarrassing. And so I think in much the same way that squatting or benching a max like would force me to be like very, very present, I think I got a similar thing out of basketball as well. And other sports where your mind could wander a little bit, my mind did wander and I just hated them. Like I played baseball growing up, and dude, there's downtime between every pitch. And like, brother, that killed me. Yeah. So yeah, I think I think that the types of exercise that I've gravitated towards in my life probably have been impacted by ADHD. Yeah, I think that's plausible.
Beautiful.
Oh, and ping
All right.
pong, very fast paced.
Ping
Gotta
pong
be
is nice
very
as well.
focused. I
A
fucking
few
love
times I've
ping
played,
pong, dude.
yeah,
It
it was
rocks.
super cool. Or reckless driving. That's another one. Like, just try it out. That's Milo's hobby, so I'm just echoing him for the record.
Yeah,
All
but
right.
no, I am a bit of an adrenaline junkie. Yeah. How about you? Do you think that influenced your choice of exercise, Pack?
Yeah, for sure. Even to this day, like I'll go to the gym and I'll be like, cool, we're gonna specifically with squatting. What you said about squatting, that was the one time when I never got as strong as you, but when I was consistently squatting over 5 plates in each workout, the focus that required was cool. It was one of the few times where I was just purely zoned in. And then back to it. But yeah, chasing those mini PRs was, and it still is, stimulating. Lemonade was a cool drink, and it still is. Whoever gets the reference, throw it down in the comments. I think Milo got it. Greg, did you?
No,
I think I got it.
That
It
sounds
rings a bell.
That sounds like a Bill Hicks bit, but not.
No,
I think
from
a
a
slightly
rap song,
different
right?
setup.
It's a popular drink and still is not a cool drink. It's a gangstar
thought so.
reference.
Hey, there we go.
Next.
By the way, Pac was this close to singing basketball is my favorite sport. I love the way they dribble up and down the court earlier when you were speaking about basketball being your favorite sport. So
Hell yeah, little
just
Bow
be
Wow.
grateful.
Curtis Blow was one of the first rappers I ever listened to. And then I found
Bars.
out Blow was a reference to a specific drug, and Curtis Blow wasn't like this jolly dude and was actually pretty gangsta.
Anyways, back to mental health and lifting. Greg, do you want to hit the next question?
Sure. Yeah. So, got no Mike sorry from Reddit says, is the mental health benefits from resistance training additive on top of mental health benefits from cardio? Are there mental health benefits for resistance training above and beyond the benefits from working on any new skill? Are the mental health benefits more of a long-lasting systematic change over time or a temporary boost for the day?
Wow, that's a lot of questions. First, is it additive on top of cardio? Based on the research, I would say probably not, but depending on how much overall exercise you're doing across the week. Like, I couldn't tell you for now that you're getting anything special mental health-wise from adding in cardio if you're just lifting, or from adding in lifting if you're just doing cardio. So as long as you're doing sufficient amounts of exercise across the week, I don't think there's anything additive there necessarily. Could be that there is, but we just haven't been able to really see it from the research from sort of like a big picture view. With regards to mental health benefits for resistance training above and beyond the benefits from working on any new skill, I don't know. I think there probably is, and that's just based on not me looking at the research on learning any new skills, but rather on the push for lifting and exercise more broadly for mental health being more of a thing than just engaging in any hobby. Like, it seems like physical activity specifically seems to be more beneficial compared to a lot of other interventions or activities. Like, I know that in some studies, the control group, so for example, in a study looking at the effects of lifting on depressive symptoms in a depressed population, you might be assigning one group to lifting and the other group to a non-active control group. Sometimes that non-active control group might involve things like reading or other activities that, while not necessarily falling strictly into learning any new skill category, it would still be roughly in the same ballpark, I would think. So I do tend to think there's something additive about physical activity and, by extension, resistance training above any other new skill. And finally, are the mental health benefits more of a long-lasting systemic change or a temporary boost? I don't really know. I would tend to think that there is more of a longer-lasting boost. many of the studies that find an effect, like as I reviewed earlier, generally the effects on mood are thought to last like 24 hours or less typically. And so in many of these studies, they're exercising twice or 3 times a week, and yet there are very notable decreases in negative symptoms associated with mental health conditions. So, you'd be spending 2 to 3 days out the week having that acute mood enhancing effect. So not necessarily enough to see a huge impact. I don't really know. And equally, it's worth not discounting the potential neurophysiological effects of exercise, like for example, effects on the brain and that sort of thing, more sort of morphological adaptations versus simply an acute effect. So overall, I'd say it probably isn't just an acute effect, but the acute effect likely does explain a fair amount of the effect.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. The one thing that I would potentially add, and like this is, I'll just say up top, this is fairly speculative, about the first question for benefits of combination of cardio and resistance training versus just one or the other, is like I suspect that there are potential benefits of cardio that maybe you wouldn't get from lifting, namely like low and moderate intensity cardio can help with like autonomic regulation, which may improve some like perceptions of stress tolerance. And I don't think you see those same types of adaptations to resistance training, or like maybe to some extent, but like not to nearly the same degree. So like, yeah, for certain things where that may be like meaningful and relevant, I do think that that's like a unique benefit that you could get from cardio. As to whether, so that's for kind of like low to moderate intensity cardio. I don't know that there are like specific mental or like neurophysiological benefits of lifting that you couldn't also get from like moderate to higher intensity cardio. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. So my suspicion, like my hunch, and again, this is, I don't have like studies I could point to. This is like a non-expert opinion, but it is my opinion, is I think that probably the largest benefits will come from either cardio or a combination of lifting and cardio. But I think there would probably be some maybe small marginal benefits that you might miss out on if all you did was lifting, due to specifically like the autonomic regulation benefits that you can get from cardio. So I don't think that you could like, I suspect that you can't like fully max things with only lifting. But I also think that for most people, most of the time, that shouldn't be anything to dissuade you from doing the type of exercise you want to do. Like if the choice is like resistance training or nothing, yeah, resistance training, it's great. I think that if of a pie where there's a potential for 100% of benefits, I suspect you could still get 90% of the benefits from only resistance training. But I do think there is maybe like a little slice, like one particular type of thing that may be unique to cardio.
Pack, anything to add there?
You both covered me, more than covered me, so...
Beautiful. We have one last question, I think, Greg.
Okay, from Tamcac on Reddit, says, hello, long-time listener, first-time commenter / asker. As coaches, what do you do when you notice exercise has become a mental crutch for someone? In other words, when they abuse exercise as a means of avoiding dealing with the mental health-related problem. Thank you.
So, I'm going to give the correct answer, I think, of still encouraging them to exercise in general, but potentially, as a coach, try to open an empathetic and open dialogue about them potentially having something to look into. It's a difficult thing to do as a coach, because ultimately you don't want to extend past your scope. And the aim of opening that conversation is not for you to resolve that person's mental health issues on your own, like ever, essentially, because that is not within your scope, that is not within your expertise to do so. It is more so to essentially, potentially encourage the person to at least look into contacting a medical professional to see whether or not there is something there in the first place, getting a potential diagnosis, and then exploring treatment options from there. But I think that as a coach in that situation, your role is essentially to be supportive, to sort of triage them or encourage them towards medical professionals that are able to help. And more broadly, more importantly even than that, obviously provide some social support, because that's a good thing in general, but just encourage them to keep exercising to the extent that it is beneficial to them. Like obviously if their health professional advises otherwise, that is one thing. But in general, looking at the research on mental health, continuing to exercise is likely a good thing. So if you can employ strategies to increase their adherence to an exercise protocol, that is likely the best you can do as a coach beyond just referring them outwards to improve their mental health. So that's kind of my take on what I would do as a coach. And hopefully Greg agrees with me, because I've been, up till now, a Strong by Science coach. So, hey, if I messed up, now's the time to tell me.
I think, yeah, I think absent like a diagnosis or working with, like a mental health professional, I don't think that that's necessarily unreasonable. I do think that there are, yeah, like I'll fully admit I'm outside my depth on this. I wouldn't be surprised if there are instances where, like, if someone has like formal exercise addiction or whatever, like it wouldn't be surprising to me if there would be instances where a professional might say like, hey, look, maybe not for a while, or like whatever type of exercise they seem to be doing in like a compulsive and counterproductive way, maybe try to like cut back on that or try something else. Like I don't know. Like those are things that it would not surprise me if a mental health professional said something along those lines. I mean, my general thing is, yeah, like if someone seems to be dealing with something that intersects with things within my area of expertise, but which is outside my area of expertise, and yeah, so something like this would fall under that umbrella. Something like eating disorders would fall under that umbrella. Some sort of like serious acute injury that someone would need to talk to a PT for would fall under this umbrella. Usually I tend to take the kind of like first do no harm approach of just saying like, hey, look, you seem to be dealing with something here that maybe I'm not the most equipped to be able to help you with. Ultimately, exercise is good, but I don't want to be facilitating something that's like leading you down a bad road. So, maybe we just push pause for now, and I think you probably need to talk to someone. And yeah, then we can kind of circle back once you've gotten some of the help you need, or once you've talked to someone who would be equipped to give you the help you need. And what they might tell you is, yeah, you can go back and keep doing whatever you were doing. But yeah, like usually my take is just to kind of like push pause until a second opinion can be gleaned. Or I'll say, look, you clearly have a lot of anxiety because you're paying for this coaching package month to month. But if you sign up for the yearly package, that's really going to put you at ease and fix it. No, I'm just kidding about that.
We'll tell the podcast editor to edit right at that point.
It's too late. I've already employed that strategy with all of my clients.
Hopefully people would know that was a joke, but I'm sure one person wouldn't.
Hey.
Oh, man. Yeah.
For that one person. StrongerByScience.com/coaching. But yeah. Just kidding.
Yeah, I largely agree. I do think it's a tricky situation to navigate as a coach.
Yeah.
But yeah, Pac, anything to add there?
It's like I haven't, to be honest, I haven't had many clients that said, "Hey, I like exercise or training at the moment is really making things harder." But you both pretty much covered me. Like, it would depend on the case as well and what we're talking about. If it's more serious, yeah, it would be the Greg route. If it was something less serious, which I'm not even sure I'm qualified to fully determine, but it would depend on the individual, how much we're communicating. Because with a lot of clients, especially the long-term clients, there is that sort of rapport where, you know, we know each other as people to an extent, right? So it would depend, but I would always recommend that, hey, you know, it's probably best to consult a professional versus solely relying on just the training or asking me for advice for something that I'm not really qualified for. Obviously, I'm happy to empathize and say, hey, you know, during stressful periods of time, I've seen that this has helped, or, you know, we can try this and you can see if it helps. But it's also probably best to consult an actual, you know, psychologist, therapist, whatever.
Cool, beautiful. I think that rounds us out. Greg, would you do the honor?
Sure. Well, before we wrap up, do either of you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Personally, I don't know. I'll just throw the anecdote there for whatever's worth. With like lifting specifically, really helped me to get familiar with the idea that, hey, you do work, good things happen, and build that sort of mental, I guess, space in my head. And at the same time, with the anxiety and the panic disorder stuff, lifting was one of the few times in my day where things would stop in my head and I'd be feeling good. So that's just a little anecdote for whoever, you know, empathizes and wants to hear that, hey, other people are going through it as well, without it being medical advice, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, similarly to Pac, I think that what I've noticed with lifting is that when I lift, I tend to be able to take things more in stride. So whatever life is throwing my way, whether it's higher stress, higher workload, a situation that should be provoking more distress or more anxiety or what have you, if I've lifted on that day, I'm just able to take it more in stride and navigate it more calmly and not experience it as negatively and with as much difficulty, essentially. So to me, lifting just essentially allows me to turn the rest of my life from sort of harder mode to easier mode a little bit, mentally. So yeah, do your exercise, improve your mental health, and I don't know, that's what I would do. As a result of this podcast, there's not a ton of other practical takeaways besides exercise tends to be good for mental health. Greg, anything to add?
My anecdote is my anecdote is like I bet people could have inferred this from some of the things I've said on this episode, but for the most part, exercise has tended to be a positive for me. Like, yeah, my subjective experience dovetails quite a bit with the things you guys just described. The exception is like when there became a point where I for a time was like, I think like got too obsessively focused on the numbers in powerlifting and let that dictate a lot for me, where if I had a good workout, I'd be in a really good mood all day. And if I had a bad workout, I'd be in a really bad mood until my next workout. And then I'd be in a really bad mood until my next workout again, if the next workout wasn't good. And yeah, that wasn't ideal. For me, the thing that helped the most with that was doing like the Bulgarian style squat every day thing. Cause like you're going to have some good days, you're going to have some bad days, and you just have to let them wash over you like water. And I think that helped me gain a healthier perspective on it. But yeah, like, for most of my life and in most regards, exercise has been positive, but there have been times where an excessive focus on outcomes over process have at times made it counterproductive for me. And yeah, so I just wanted to give that note and a little bit of warning, because I, would prefer other people to not have to deal with that.
100%.
Yeah, no, I've been in a similar spot before to an extent where I find that if I place too many expectations on the progress in the gym, that tends not to be a good thing for the mental health promoting effects of lifting. I think when I focus more on the process and just doing the thing, that's when it tends to be best. So I can certainly empathize with that from my more powerlifting heavy days.
All right. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Stronger by Science podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and we will talk to you again in another 2 weeks. And until then, get some exercise, lift some weights. Hopefully that puts you in a more positive affective state between now and then. And we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Bye.
Peace.